We are in James chapter 3, beginning that chapter, as a matter of fact. We ended, obviously, on the end of chapter 2. But he begins this section as he actually begins, says at really beginning of chapter 1 and chapter 2, it is, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. Let's look at this for a second. Okay, let not many of you become teachers. Well, my first question is, what's wrong with being a teacher? Why wouldn't you want them being a teacher? If we just consider like Hebrews 5 and verse 12, for by this time you ought to be teachers. The writer of Hebrews is saying, well, telling the people that he's writing to, by this time you ought to be teachers. You're not being teachers. And of course, at the end of Matthew chapter 28 and verse 20, Jesus saying, teaching them to observe all things that I commanded you. He's calling us to be teachers. Now James is saying, let not many of you be teachers. Why? Now he does say, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. So that gives us a little bit of insight into what's going on, why he would say that. But we're going to get more as to why he's saying that, because we can't just divorce this new section saying my brethren from the rest of what he's going to say after this, of chapter 3 at least, with the things he's going to say concerning the tongue, and then he's going to be talking about wisdom and the difference between worldly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. And we can't just strip it away from that. But we need to understand some things, that when he says, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment, why? When someone becomes a teacher of the Word of God, they need to know what they are teaching. They've got to know it. And while all of us, including myself, make mistakes, we are held responsible for teaching the truth, for teaching the whole doctrine, the whole counsel of God. We are responsible for it, not to change anything, not to alter anything, to teach it conscientiously. And like anybody else, as we learn, all teachers begin to teach as they have learned. I have a new understanding of this verse. I have a new conclusion that I've come to because of other verses now teaching me these things. Whether it's an absolute correction of I have taught this wrong, and now I know the truth about the matter, or I know something a little bit more deep, that I was pretty shallow on this years ago, but now I understand a little bit more. Everybody does that. Everybody. And it is up to us to learn. It is for a teacher to be a good teacher, they must be a good student. And it is a true student, a real student of the Bible, and not let traditions filter into your reading, not let things that, I've always been taught this, therefore it must be true. But to go and look to see, well, if you were taught this, what justification is there? What defense is there that truly is from the Bible? And understanding that we've got to teach the Bible, not traditions, or not the things that we've been taught simply because we've been taught. So, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. Well, was there a rush to be teachers? Because that seems to be the case. And if we take the rest of this chapter, especially when it speaks of envy and self-seeking, was that part of it? Was it a rush to be a notoriety? A rush to notoriety? Was it a rush to be important and to seem important? Was this part of self-seeking? And most certainly, one could become a teacher and a preacher for the sake of self-seeking. That they have get themselves a following, and they get themselves a loyalty, and that's what they are after. And if they don't get it, then they're off to something else. Most certainly that has been the case with some out there. Was it the case here? Were they out for this self-appointed rabbiship, as one commentator put it? Did they want this idea of, like with the Pharisees, of seeming important, seeming like a someone in the church? There's the Pauls in the worlds. You know, I want that notoriety. Okay? Well, with Paul, he got that notoriety for doing the work, for being a faithful apostle, and for going through all kinds of hardship. He is genuine. And of course, he was appointed to be an apostle and was a faithful teacher as far as anything we've ever seen. But you know, the idea is not for the notoriety. It's not for that, you know, that sense of rabbiship, not for self-seeking, but genuinely teaching the Word of God for the love of God and the love of mankind, the love of others, and to help them along. Now, we come to verse 2, and it starts with the word for. Okay, let's not strip verse 1 from verse 2, because this word for is connecting this. It is like an example, or because we all stumble in many things. Now, James is saying he stumbles because he says we. He's not saying you. He says we stumble in many things. Was he not a teacher? Yeah, he's a teacher, and so he's rather prominent as well, rather well known, and he says he stumbles in many things. So, how does he get to be a teacher? And he's warning them, be careful about being a teacher. What's the difference in all of this? Well, it's not just barreling into something and we'll figure it out when we get there, because you're toying with people's lives. You know, if I were just to decide I'm going to make myself a plumber, okay, I know very, very little about plumbing, okay, and I could go and plumb this house, and when they actually turn on the water, then they're going to say, ooh, this doesn't work quite well, does it? Something's wrong. But guess what? While that may have hurt a house, it harms no soul whatsoever. I'm not saying that I would ever do that, but it harms no soul at all. Whereas someone who just barrels into teaching, having no idea what they're doing, no idea at all. They don't know what the Bible teaches on a specific subject. They don't know the text that they're reading. They know very little. Then that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem. And you're going to be teaching people things that they're quite likely going to retain and adjust their lives accordingly. And you're teaching them, they're learning, and you're teaching them something that's simply not the Bible. All right, that's not good. That can lead to a lot of problems down the line. But he says, for we stumble in many things. Now he's beginning a subject on the tongue, but once again, let's not take it away from verse 1. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. So this may be a clue as to why they should not all be teachers. in this. This may be a clue that they have problems with their tongue. And as we're going to see, first off, a tongue, obviously, like with Peter in Mark 14 and verse 71, Peter is denying knowing Jesus of Nazareth. He's denying it, and then he begins to curse and swear, which is, as I described, that's like the test. That's the litmus test to worldliness. Okay, show me how worldly you are. Well, they're convinced that he has been with Jesus of Nazareth, and to prove that he wasn't, which he's lying, but to try to prove that he wasn't, he begins to curse and swear that anyone following Jesus of Nazareth, and they would know it, would not be saying these things. And there's that test of worldliness. I'm like everybody else. I'm just as worldly as they get. And I don't know who you're even talking about, which they were never convinced of it. Not only is there that part of the tongue, but there's more parts as well. It's not just cursing and swearing. It's that of repeating lies, or it's that of gossip and talebearers. People's lives are destroyed. Friendships are burned because of words. Someone going out of their way to destroy a friendship, and it doesn't have to be one or the other trying to do it. It could be a third party who's done it and spread tales about the other, and they've divided these two friends up. And it could be that never gets repaired ever. That never gets repaired. But there's also the part in this of being a false teacher, whether you know it or not. And I'm convinced there's a lot of people out there who have no idea they are false teachers. They do not know. There's some that do know. They're working on by their own cleverness and by manipulating people. They very well know they're false teachers. And I think you've got a number of televangelists. They know very well what they're saying and that it's not the gospel of Christ. They know that, but they got to keep the crowds. They got to keep that impressive number in there of how many thousands of people just packing that auditorium every Sunday. They've got to do it because it brings in a lot of revenue. And so they'll preach it however the people like it. And when they like it, they keep coming back. That's another misuse of the tongue. That's another misuse. But let's continue on. In these next two verses, he's making a comparison. Horses can be restrained, ships can be steered, and then it goes to how destructive the tongue is. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. And so you have these. One is a very large animal. He can be restrained, or she can be restrained. The horse can be restrained or guided, and it's not a big issue. A ship also being driven by winds can be guided ever so neatly wherever the pilot wants to go. And so these things can be guided, but then he talks about the tongue, that the tongue seems to have no restraint at all. The tongue seems to be something that we have to keep an eye on. And even so, verse 5, even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. All right? That's not a small statement. And it's not a statement that we should just glide right over. That words can create firestorms. They can do it. And you've known people, I know you have, I've known people that they seem to pride themselves that they always speak their mind. It's a pride for them. But that's not a virtue. Speaking your mind is not a virtue. Having a filter, thinking something, you can't help but think something. You can't help but. But that doesn't mean you speak it. And you may have an opinion on something at the moment, but that opinion could change. Facts could come in. But you don't just blare it out. What's the whole thing of being quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath? What's the whole deal in that? That you listen and you remain quiet until it's time to speak. All right? And just someone who just blurts out the first thing that comes to their mind, someone that just speaks their mind and they're oblivious, or maybe they even take the delight that people are offended by it. Well, that really is not a good trait at all. And I remember when our children were small, and small children, they don't have social skills. They don't know when they may be saying something that, we don't want you saying that. Stop that. Okay, that someone has entered in that is, I'll just come up with a quick example, that would take a child, just like, we'll just say, overly large person, all right? An overly large person. While the rest of us just greet that person, that's very, good to have you here, or whatever, that the child has got to say something. The child's got to say something. They don't have that same filter, and they haven't matured yet. And while children can get away with it, and everyone understands a child is a child, this can still be hurtful, nevertheless. But when an adult just cannot keep themselves restrained with their tongue, then problems can grow. Okay? They begin there, and they can just get worse and get worse. Now, just looking at a few things. From Proverbs 26, verses 18 to 22, we have deceiving a neighbor, a talebearer, and a contentious man. All of those are from the tongue. All of those are for, and understand, someone who is mute can still pass along gossip. Okay. Someone who can't speak, obviously can pass along gossip. And today, someone can pass along gossip if they didn't talk to anybody. They just went to a keyboard and typed it all down. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And in Proverbs 16 to Proverbs 6, 16 to 19, we have these 6 things the Lord hates, yet yes, 7 are an abomination to Him. All right? And 3 of those things, 3 of the 7 are a lying tongue, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among brethren. All of those are from the tongue. All of those. 3 of the things that the Lord hates. 3 of the 7. Now, let's just explain for the benefit of those who are unaccustomed to that saying, that it's an idiom. These 6 things the Lord hates, yes, 7 are an abomination to Him. Okay, is it 6 or is it 7? Which is it? Are you unsure about this? That's a Hebraic saying. That's a saying of the Hebrews. That was not uncommon. That it is, in fact, 7 things that are listed, but it's just a Hebrew saying. How did it come about? I don't know. I don't know. But understand that it's just an idiom is what it is. But the point we want to make is that along with hands that shed innocent blood are these 3 that are from the tongue. These 3 that are there. So see how great a forest a little fire kindles. Yeah, it doesn't take much. I remember years ago, it was in 1998. I remember the year. And the county where we were living, that summer had forest fires all over the place. And they were having to close down roads, major roads. And there briefly, it seemed like the only way to get out of the county is either you take a boat or you fly out. And it was just really bad. And they were first off wondering if the fires weren't initially started by lightning, which is possible, but then they began cropping up all over the place. It wasn't like it started here and now it's spreading out like that. It's here spreading out, but now it's way over here, and now it's over here, and now it's over here, and now it's over here. And they were coming to a conclusion that, yeah, you've got somebody starting these fires. That's what's going on. And they wouldn't need much, as dry as the woods were. It wouldn't take much. And we come to this idea of, see how great a forest a little fire kindles. It just grows. And here is just this tongue that is misused, and it can, as we have said, it can divide friendships. It can divide friendships. And I will say, and just admit, that there are times when I have said something that I've immediately regretted it. I've immediately thought, why did I just say that? That was the dumbest thing I could have said at this moment. And, you know, you can apologize, and you need to, but you can't unring the bell. You can't unring it. Once you ring it, it's there. You apologize as quickly as you can. But that person gets an insight into, yeah, the darker side of you, or something you should not have been thinking, or what you have been thinking. It's probably what their conclusion is. And you just apologize as quickly and as greatly as you can, but there is harm that's done. There's harm that's in it. And all this coming from, it's just a share of information. That's what it is. Just and information going from one human to another human is powerful, very, very powerful. And of course, the more influential a person may be, which would be a teacher, but there are greater influences beyond that. But as with someone who has a greater influence, they have a greater impact both for good and for ill. And that saying something could affect the way people think about you, or the way they think in general, or the way they think about somebody else. And you could find yourself dividing people when that's not really what you were wanting to do. But there's a fire that is started nonetheless. Now, here we have this section, verses 5 and 6, where the tongue is compared to fire. It can create this little kindling. Wood creates a fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. So here is the tongue. The tongue is a fire. It defiles the body. It can set on fire the course of nature. Wars can be started by words. And you can have, that can be between very large nations, or it can be just small family groups or small tribes. It can occur and has occurred. And where words spoken by someone influential, spoken by the right person or the wrong person, however you want to look at it, that word carried a greater weight than others would have ever carried. And people died because of And there is no accounting for all of the harm that's been done and even lives lost because of something being said. Now, I will take just a moment, and it will require us getting on a different subject altogether. But having a conversation, it was a member of the church, having a conversation, he was an older man, and we were talking about the subject of abortion and how abortion is the killing of a human being. It is murder. It's as easy as that. It's as easy as that. Call it what you like. Call this child what you like. It doesn't matter. Some have called the baby a parasite. The baby is not a parasite. The baby is precisely what the human body was intended to produce. All right. Now we're discussing babies unborn, and we're discussing abortion, and he believed that life, that the human soul did not enter the body until their first breath. Okay? And I asked him, how'd you come to that conclusion? And he went all the way back to Genesis, that God breathed into Adam the breath of life. Well, that doesn't mean that Adam obtained his soul just by breath. That means Adam was dead, or I should say lifeless, absolutely lifeless, until God brought him to life and he breathed in him the breath of life, and he lived. He's just dust to begin with that's now been formed, and then God breathes in him the breath of life, and now he's alive. And the same thing would have been for Eve. Eve began, a rib is taken out of Adam, formed into Eve, and that rib would not have been a living human being at that point, but now formed as Eve and the breath of life in her, now she is a living human being. But what resides in the womb is a living human being, independent in many ways, its own heartbeat, digestive system. Once we get to that point, as the child begins to grow, it has more and more and more human features, that's for sure. But when does the soul enter into it? The soul enters in at conception, because that creates a human conception. Human conception. Now you have a human being, and no more information is needed. You have a human being that's going to continue to grow for years to come. All right, like for a typical child, you're looking about around age 18. 18 years, and that child has come to full development. That's a long time. Okay. At what point does that person become a person? What's at conception? It's not when they're full grown. It's not when they take the breath of life. Now, I've said that to say this. In talking with that man, he said, well, it doesn't really bother me one way or another. He was just giving up. He wasn't going to change his way because he said the implication of it. I said, what implication of it? And he didn't want to tell me. Well, it meant he was pro-abortion. That's why he didn't want to tell me the implication. And I said, what implication? He didn't want to tell me. He said, well, that's okay. It doesn't matter. My wife and I will never have children. This isn't a point anymore. And I said, but you have grandchildren. You can teach them. You have children that, though I don't know that I ever met them, I guess they might have still been in childbearing years. I have no idea. But there was definitely grandchildren, and you could teach them the wrong thing, and they destroy lives in their time by way of following this notion that an unborn child is just a nothing. It's not human at all. Okay? there is an issue with that. If he taught anyone, I don't know if he did or not. If he taught anyone, he's going to be held responsible for teaching that. He's unless he corrected it, he is going to be held responsible for that. And that's why we have to look at, in becoming a teacher, is what is expected out of us, but learning the doctrine of Christ, well, that's expected out of us from the beginning. That's expected out of us from the start, to learn and then teach as we learn. And as we come across something that, maybe we've never even heard before, some issue we've never even, not only are we not familiar with it, it's not even been a concept. And it comes around, well, what do we do now? We go and we look at the Word of God and find the principle behind it. Find the principle of, is this right or is this wrong? How do we teach this? How do we look at this from a biblical perspective? And guaranteed, no matter what the subject is, moral subject, we can find the principles and the laws concerning it in the biblical text. Sometimes earlier than you may realize, earlier in the Bible than you may realize. But my point in all of this is concerning this tongue that is a fire, and it can destroy, and it can kill people. People can be killed and have been killed because of it. Now, I'm not saying that the people that James is writing to are guilty of that, but he wants to stop it so they're not. He wants to give them this word of warning so they're not guilty of it, and that they will begin to rein themselves in and really just control themselves and look at what they're doing, why they're doing it, and are they at this point ready to do it? Are they at this point ready? Now, we come to verses 7 and 8, and it's the tongue is compared to animals being tamed. There's this comparison. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Now it's compared to poison. So we have this comparison between animals. If you've ever been to the zoo, I think you have. They've got animals in there that have been caught, and now they're in the zoo, in wherever they are, or whatever cage or house or whatever it is they're in. And some of those animals aren't very dangerous at all. Okay, a hedgehog doesn't seem very, I've never been bitten by one. I've never had much encounter with a hedgehog. But I don't think a hedgehog's going to be that dangerous. But there are some things in there that are quite dangerous. Of a rhinoceros and a polar bear or a tiger, or an elephant can be extremely dangerous. And all of those can be put into confines and fed and kept, and there they are. Okay, there they are. But then he goes to the tongue, and the tongue is harder in all of this. But no man can tame the tongue. And I take that to be very literal. That there are times when one can control what they say. One can have a complete hold of oneself. But then at other times, things just get through, and we didn't really want that, but they got through. I remember my brother-in-law, and he wouldn't mind me telling this, is when he was a teenager. And I didn't know him when he was a teenager, but my brother-in-law, when he was a teenager, his dad was a preacher. And he had been up to, my brother-in-law, I think he was about 16 years old, had been up to no good, and lots of it. And for the first time in his life, he got his father so upset that his father cursed. And he felt so guilty about that. I'm sure the father did too, but he felt guilty that he broke his dad. That restraint that had been there, and just broke it, and he felt guilty about that. Now, no man can tame the tongue. That it can surprise you as to what can get through. Of here is the mind and here is the tongue, and we can have full control over what flows what flows to the tongue, and then all of a sudden we don't. Out of frustration, out of anger, out of fright, out of anxiety, out of grief, whatever it is, that it can fall out. And he is warning us of this, that while birds and reptiles and beasts and all these things can be contained, and some animals, like the horse, has already mentioned that, some of them can be domesticated. Powerful animal that no human could really stop on their own by their own strength, but we can do it nonetheless. We can keep a horse and other animals as well, of where they're very powerful, but we can restrain them nevertheless. But the tongue is different, and he's showing these analogies of fire, and now with and also poison, and truly it is poison, and now with wild beasts, to emphasize what the tongue is capable of doing. Now we go to verse 9. And here we have this idea of the tongue being switched back and forth from good and evil. And as people know, with everybody, almost without exception, after I say everybody, almost without exception, that everybody can have a good side to them. Everybody can. That even someone who's a hardened criminal can have a sense of wanting to do good, and somebody really needs it and can be generous or whatever, and do some good. And everybody, this is without exception, while having some good, can also do things that they should not have done. And we can be a mixed box of things. There's good, and there is good things that we have done and bad things that we have done. And just like with James just said, for we all stumble in many things. But the idea is not to delight in the stumbling. The idea is to begin to work on that. That's the plan. That is what Christ is calling us to do, is to work on that, to stop, turn away from that. And when Christ says we can turn away from it, when our Creator says we can turn away from it, we can turn away from it. It's not impossible. Now, verse 9. With it, that's the tongue, we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Okay, what did James and John do that earned them the nickname of Boanerges? Sons of thunder. It wasn't because of loving kindness that they were given that name. And it wasn't because of patience they were given that name. They're given that name because there was a Samaritan village that wouldn't allow them to pass through, and they got angry about it and wanted to rain fire and brimstone on the village. Okay, that's James and John. Those are, in my book, John, I highly respect John. But look at what he did. Look at what he did. And I have no need to not admire James, but look at what he was part of as well. Okay? And have I done any differently when I'm on I-85, and the traffic has stopped? Now, while raining fire and brimstone might be a thing, it won't help the traffic any. It won't get me through any, but I'm no different because I'm angry that someone has done something stupid. And it could be that, okay, I need a little bit more sympathy here because someone may be flying out to a hospital, or there could be something very serious that has occurred. But it's still, it is part of the human condition. It is part of who we are. That yes, we can stumble in many things, and we can stumble with our tongue. Now, blessing God, cursing men who've been made in the similitude of God. Now understand, going back to Genesis 9 and verse 6, we are forbidden, and we don't have to wait till the Ten Commandments. Genesis 9 and 6, we are commanded that we have no right to kill innocent human beings. No right whatsoever. But someone can forfeit that right by killing an innocent human being with Genesis 9:6, following that law. Okay. Not only are we not to murder each other, but we're not to be doing this either, of cursing each other. Who is in the similitude, made in the similitude of God. You're made in the image of God. I'm made in the image of God. People on the other side of the world are made in the image of God. We're all that way. And we don't have a right. That there shouldn't be this, as he's going to explain, bitter and sweet water. That it should be just fresh water. It should be that. But, all right, let's finish this section, and we'll need to call it for the day. But verse 10, out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. It shouldn't. You shouldn't do that. You know, what would be the proper response of James and John to pray for to bless their enemies? Actually, that somehow the Samaritans, because of their lack of hospitality, Samaritans really didn't do anything to them physically. They just said, no, you can't come through. That's what they said. All right, as bad as that might be, you don't call for the destruction of that village. But James and John praying for them to be blessed, well, that's more of what they should have been doing, not to say that I know better than them, only from Scripture, and knowing that I can do the same thing. I can do the same thing, but what we ought to be doing is the opposite of wishing good for such a person, because they are in the image of God. Now verse 10, we've done verse 10. Verse 11, does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? And of course, this is a rhetorical question. The answer, as you should know, is no, it doesn't. That in certain areas of the world, Yellowstone would be one of those places, but it's not the only place where you can find springs of water, and it would be okay to drink that. There'd be no problem at all. But there'd be other springs of water where it may be boiling. Number two, but then again, it might not. But number two, it may be actually quite poisonous because it's coming from deep down and it can have some things in it that you don't need to be drinking. Sulfur, but not just sulfur. It would probably have that sulfur smell. But there would be other things mixed in that water that you just don't need to be drinking that. But you don't have one fountain that's doing both. A little bit along here and a little bit along there. Bitter for a bit and fresh for a bit. It's one or the other. And the tongue manages to do both, and shouldn't be. And that's why he's reeling them in, and encouraging us to do the same thing, obviously, and giving us the same warnings concerning this. That, while the saying that you learned as a child, someone called you a name, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, in insult, you can let that slide off. It ought to. But words can start things where it didn't exactly slide off. That it started something that should never have been. And so we will continue, and I want to thank you for being with us, and hopefully we can get back to chapter 3. Thank you.